Welcome to Hotspot, a Swedish YouTube channel and podcast that covers current topics that reflects ideas that shape our time. Today's guest will be Konstantin Kisin, a British satiric, author and co-host in Triggernometry. And Konstantin is also a rising star on social media. Welcome, Konstantin.
Thanks for having me, Marco. I appreciate it.
You have become a rising star on social media. The first time I saw you was when you were at Oxford Union and speaking about this house believes that woke has gone too far. And I'm just wondering, how come that you are putting yourself in the cultural war when it comes to woke ideas? It has to be a high price for you as former comedian to be out there on the front line and be in confrontation with the woke ideas?
Well, first of all, I never put myself in the culture war. I simply said what I thought, and then other people decided either to like it or not like it. That's really up to them. I had the exact same opinions about things before anyone knew my name or who I was, when I was just a circuit comedian here in the UK. And look, the price, yes, some people don't like me speaking the truth in this way, but also I have a very large YouTube channel. I have a large following. That I have I lost a lot of friends, but I have many new friends. So I certainly wouldn't describe myself as a victim of this. I think actually the overwhelming majority of people in our societies now are starting to realize what's going on. And personally, I've enjoyed all the benefits of being on the right side of that argument.
Okay. You have also written a book that recently came out in Swedish called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. In this book, you compare things that happened in the Soviet Union that your parents went through, your grandparents, where there was a lot of indoctrination and certain behaviors that you see a lot of similarities in the West today. Can you just give an example of some of these similarities?
Well, you know, a lot has been said over the years about the connection between Marxism and wokeness. And very, very briefly, if you think about what Marxism is, which is what we had in the Soviet Union, it's based primarily on this idea that there is an oppressor group and an oppressed group. There are people who are taking advantage of others, and there are people who are being taken advantage of. And according to the Marxist analysis, what we need to do is equalize the two by taking away from the oppressors and by giving to the oppressed. So what's happened in our societies is we've essentially taken that idea, and instead of applying it to class, which is what Marx was doing, we've begun to apply it to things like race, sex, sexuality, etc., which is why equity, which is this classic Marxist term, has become such a common thread, which is why we have DEI programs. These are all ways of attempting to tear people down and elevate others without any reference to meritocracy whatsoever.
When it comes to this this war between these different kind of groups, it becomes a wedge in the Western society. How do we overcome this wedge where we are tearing our own society apart?
By winning. I think the ideology that I'm talking about is antithetical to everything our civilization stands for. It is destructive, suicidal, and if you want to see evidence of this, you only need to look at what's happening now. We have found ourselves in a place of complete moral inversion. I was, for example, somebody who was a vocal opponent of the war in Iraq in 2003, and I remember going to the protests. And I remember that we stood there with placards like "Don't bomb Iraq," "No to war," etc. If you go to these protests against let's say, the bombing of Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities, they are filled with flags and pictures of the enemies of the West. They are filled with the flags of Iran. Here in London, we often see Hamas and Hezbollah flags and leaders being celebrated, the Ayatollah and his pictures being everywhere. And so instead of seeing this as a let's not allow our governments to make a bad decision, this is now fundamentally a society in which there is a fifth column. There is a group of people within our society who hate the West and who are convinced that it's the root of all evil and will work with anyone from Islamists to foreign powers like Russia and China, to attempt to undermine and destroy it. So how do we solve this? By winning and completely decimating the ideology of wokeness, which is whose purpose is, in my opinion, to destroy the West.
And how do we win?
Well, my approach to winning in this case is to argue for the truth, to tell people the truth about what's happening, to remind them that what they're being told is a lie, the history that is being presented to them of Western civilization is a lie, that when they're told that Western civilization is uniquely evil, responsible for all the terrible things that have ever happened in the world, that that's not true, and in fact that we are the most progressive, the most tolerant, the most anti-racist societies in history, and that people who want to present that as the opposite are simply lying, and they're doing it to deceive and to mislead.
But how do you prevail when the voices that are so anti-West has a lot of the platforms in the maybe public service, the legacy media and so on? The platforms you have is mainly on the social media, but the majority of people are not receiving their news from these platforms.
Yeah, I don't think that's quite true anymore. I mean, yes, of course, certainly with me, the source of my audience is online. But I've been, we have a program here in the UK called Question Time. It's the most watched, the most popular flagship TV commentary and political debate program in the country. I've been on that program 5 times now. My book was a Sunday Times bestseller in the first week of its publication. And I'm not alone. There are many, many people. We have media organizations and broadcasters now in this country that are presenting a different perspective. And this is happening all over the Western world. All over the Western world, there is a huge distrust of the mainstream media, and many, many people do not trust them for precisely the reasons that I'm articulating. So I feel like we're making very good progress, and this is starting to show through in legislation. It's starting to show through in election results. Yes, of course, it's taking time, and some of us will be impatient for instant change. But I believe that if we are right and if we speak the truth, we will eventually win over. And I believe that we're seeing the results of that already.
Are you see the results in legacy media as well, that there's come some kind of wake up among them, or is this too strong social pressures between them among the colleagues, or?
Well, look, it's complicated, but as I say, if someone like me is invited on Question Time 5 times in the space of a couple of years, that tells you something. And I see other people who have similar views to me becoming really powerful mainstream commentators. And of course, we know that podcasters and YouTubers are now becoming a much more powerful force as the power of the mainstream media wanes. And by the way, if this sounds abstract to some of your viewers and listeners, just put this into context. If you think about, whether you like him or not, I've never been a huge fan of President Trump, although I have certainly preferred him over the opposition in recent elections. If you look at the way that he was covered, the media told you nonstop that this guy was a Nazi, 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 fascist, 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 Nazi, Nazi, Nazi. And what we're discovering right now is this man is the most pro-Israel, pro-Jewish president in the history of the United States, certainly in my lifetime. And that is the level of dishonesty that I think people are rightly reacting to. And if that continues, people will seek sources of information elsewhere. And if the media do become more honest, well, I'm all in favor of it. I'm not someone who's ever said we need to tear down the mainstream media and destroy them. I just wish that they were more accurate and more true and more authentic and better at their jobs.
What do you see among the broad layer of people? I mean, most people are not so interested in politics. They're more interested in their ordinary lives. They consume BBC and whatever newspapers are big in the United Kingdom. Are they waking up as well, or is it just more of the people who are politically aware?
No, I think you make a good point, which is most people are not that interested in this stuff. But that's understandable. They have busy lives. They have food to put on the table. They have children to educate. They have jobs to go to, etc. But what's happened over the last 10 years is that when they go to do their job, they suddenly discover that things are changing quite rapidly. I was talking to someone who's a judge recently, who's really not political in any sort of active way, but he was telling me about the impact wokeness is having on the legal profession and on the judiciary and on the criminal justice system. If you just have a corporate job and suddenly you find that, you know, people from certain backgrounds are being promoted artificially and people from other backgrounds are being held back artificially, that's something that affects you. And of course, and this is really, really important, Marco, I don't know if you're a parent, but I know that many of your viewers and listeners will be. If you're a parent, as I am, and you send your children to nursery or to school, you begin to discover some of the things that they're being indoctrinated with. And that's when really a lot of people start to wake up, particularly when it comes to things like trans ideology, when it comes to gender ideology, when it comes to the promotion, you know, not of the acceptance of sexual minorities, which I think we'd all be for, but for the active promotion of all sorts of radical ideas about sex and gender and sexuality. There are certain schools in America, for example, and we've had episodes covering this on Triggernometry, where children are being shown explicit sexual material at school and being told about oral sex and all sorts of other things at a very, very, very young age. So when these things become part of your day-to-day life, that's when people start to wake up. To say nothing, of course, of the fact that a lot of people feel that they simply are having to not say what they think anymore. They're very careful about expressing their opinions with colleagues or at work or in a more social context. That they worry about, you know, if they say something offensive, they're going to be punished either societally or administratively in some way. So yes, most people, of course, are not fully aware of these things to the extent that you and I might be, but that's understandable. Most people are not fully aware of most political issues to the extent that people whose job it is to care about those things and to pay attention to them might be. That's normal, but I also think that this stuff is bleeding through into the lives of normal people in a very powerful way, which is why you're seeing such a powerful backlash against it.
60, 70 years ago, when the 68 student movement started, it was a very strong, radical leftist movement. They have a lot of energy. It's like the ideas from those years, those people and their ideological children and grandchildren are today the establishment. Do we see something similar, but the opposite today, with the voices of more centrist, conservative voices, that they are the counter-revolution, that they have the energy, that in the long run they will actually be again, what do we say, the establishment and have the hegemony or part of the hegemony of the narrative in society in the West?
Well, historically speaking, that would seem to be likely, given that the pendulum swings from left to right over time in this way. The way I see the role of sensible people is to make sure that as that happens, the excesses of the left are not allowed to continue and the excesses of the right are not allowed to continue. And actually, we maintain a sort of sensible, balanced political perspective where we take the best of the left and we take the best of the right and we incorporate them into a cohesive society. Because let's not forget, the reason that there are political battles between left and right is that there are many, many people in our societies who view the world through a more center-left perspective. There are many people in our societies who view the world from a more center-right perspective. And what we ideally want is to harmonize the best of both of those political perspectives into some kind of cohesive way of governing together. You know, I think the left has some very good instincts about empathy and compassion and making sure that the people who are less fortunate or perhaps less capable in some ways, the people who are disadvantaged, that we make sure to look after them. But also the right's perspectives on you know, the importance of individual freedom, liberty, the importance of entrepreneurship, the importance of allowing people to thrive and succeed, and the competitive instincts, and of course, in our modern time, the importance of making the distinction between citizens and non-citizens, the importance of making the distinction between our civilization and civilizations that don't share our values, the importance of making sure that our borders are protected from people who would want to come into our societies and either harm them or simply by virtue of being not very compatible with our societies, create tensions and problems of the kind that I think it's fair to say you're seeing in your country at the moment.
I mean, what you're talking about is like extremism, actually, and you talk about sense. Is common sense coming back again? Antonio Gramsci spoke about the common sense is something that hinders the revolution, and this is something has been also under attack, that but people speak about common sense has become like a right-wing idea. Do you think that common sense is coming back again, and the extremists, whether right or left, will be sorted out, and not just a strong pendulum from the strong left to the very extreme right?
Yeah, well, that's my worry, that we overswing in another direction, and history does seem to suggest that that is possible. So I'm very concerned. I certainly see on the fringes of the right, particularly in the United States, some very dark things happening. The absolute explosion in what I call the woke right, which is this obsession with identitarianism, obsession with victimhood, which naturally leads to hatred of Jews and other minorities, and just an overall sense that what we need in response to left-wing collectivist victimhood is right-wing collectivist victimhood. I'm very concerned about that, and it's something I've talked about a lot. It's one of the reasons I've criticized a lot of these people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens in the American media, who are fueling the fans, fanning the flames of this, rather. Yeah, that is definitely a concern. But I also hope that there is the opportunity. You can see, for example, even in the last week, that President Trump and his administration do not remotely listen to these people and don't take them particularly seriously. So there is hope. How that evolves over time is very difficult to predict. But yes, we must always be vigilant against the extremists, because they do exist on both sides, and they will capitalize on moments like this.
How come that some parts of the right has been a kind of mirror picture of the extreme left? As you say, that this identity has become so important, and victimhood. But actually, in the beginning, they were against it, and now they are for it, but the opposite side. How come that this had exported from the left to the right?
Well, I don't know if that's entirely accurate. I think there's a combination of things happening, Marco. First of all, I think there have always been collectivist identitarians on the right. It's just there was an overall sense that these are fringe figures, many of them just outright Nazis and fascists, who were completely marginalized from the mainstream conservative movement across Europe and in the United States. But what has happened, as you say rightly, is that because the woke left made identity so important, and frankly just said to, you're a straight white man, therefore you're bad and wrong and evil. And I don't know whether I'm allowed to swear on your program, but the way that people have talked about, straight white men or other groups that they consider to be oppressors for a long time, it's been so despicable and so disgusting and so, frankly, just outrageous, that you can naturally understand that a lot of young people, particularly young men, who don't really understand much about politics, but have just been told that they are disgusting all their lives just by virtue of the fact that they have a certain skin color and they have a certain set of genitals, that it's natural that they would want to rebel against that. And the question then is, do they go into these extreme ways of thinking about things, or can they be encouraged to understand that, yes, the woke left are crazy, but there are lots and lots of people who think the woke left are crazy without replicating the tactics and behavior of the woke left on the right. And that's the great battle of the future, I believe.
Another thing that you have expressed in your book, and there's been a lot of debate on and battle around, and that's the freedom of expression. Few decades ago, there was a very privileged few who could actually express themselves through media. Today, with the dawn of social media, everybody can express themselves. And with that also have come the moderation or the control what people are speaking. What do you say about the battle of the freedom of expression? Do we need to control it in some way, or is that actually an enemy to true democracy in the West?
Yeah, I think we can't be extremists about that either. I've never said that I'm a free speech absolutist. And in fact, I've always, whenever anyone asked me about that, I've always said that I'm not a free speech absolutist. I think all rational people believe that there are certain things that are beyond the pale that we would want to at least discourage from being said. It doesn't mean that they should be banned outright, but they might be deboosted or deranked on social media platforms. And I've always said that it's a very difficult thing to adjudicate. But broadly speaking, I am in favor of as light touch an approach as possible. So the situation we have in Britain at the moment, where 12,000 people a year get arrested or visited by the police for social media posts, is completely unacceptable. Does that mean that I enjoy people saying offensive and racist things on the internet? No, not really. And I think we are still in the early days of this technology, and we haven't quite worked out what the right approach is. I think that prior to the Elon Musk takeover, there was far too much of this censorship and regulation, not just on Twitter, which is now X, but actually across the board. I wonder now if certainly the way that I see what's happening on X seems to me to be, on the fringes of going in the other direction, let's put it that way. So I'm in favor of as much freedom as possible, but the emphasis being on as much freedom as possible. And I've always thought that there's some restriction and some regulation that's necessary. Moderation in order to create a healthy, vibrant space for discussion is important. And, one of the most important things is, we talk about freedom of speech, but we often don't talk about who it is that is speaking. And one of the biggest problems we face now online is that we don't actually know whether the people who are expressing information or people who are amplifying it by liking and sharing it are actually real people. I think there's a gigantic problem with bots on the internet, on platforms like X and Facebook and Instagram, that are amplifying talking points and perspectives that are not organic. And that's definitely something that's happening. Another thing, of course, is it's created the opportunity for a lot of hostile foreign actors to pretend that they are representing an opinion domestically. So, for example, there are people on Twitter who keep talking about how, this is what America should do. I'm an American. I believe this. I believe that. Who, as it turns out, are somewhere in Pakistan or in other places, but they're pretending to be Americans and pretending to be influencing the debate. So there's still a lot of things to work out. But broadly speaking, I think it is very important that the censorship regime that we had until recently was overcome.
Yeah, I remember that it was this week was somebody said, I'm born in America, I defend American rights, and then somebody exposed that he was actually born in Pakistan, as you mentioned.
Not just born in Pakistan, based in Pakistan.
Based in Pakistan.
And continuing to post from there. So this wasn't somebody who had anything to do with America. It was someone who's openly lying about who they are while attempting to influence the public debate. And this is something we're all going to have to work out, because obviously closed tyrannical societies like Russia and China, they don't allow Western social media platforms in their countries, but we allow their bot farms in our countries to influence our public debate. And that's something we're going to have to work out.
I'm also wondering, when it comes to like our legacy media, you spoke about that there is some kind of openings now for people who are more to the right or the center right. As it's been like in Sweden, and I think it's the same in England, is that the media has, instead of scrutinizing and criticizing the power being part of the power or the establishment, what do you think is the problems with that when they have the same kind of narrative?
Well, look, I don't think we should be too partisan about this, because when you have a right-wing government, there are also right-wing newspapers and right-wing broadcasters or right-wing radio stations who will overlook some of the faults of that government of the day. And you see that in the United States now. There are many media outlets that don't want to criticize the Trump administration when they're doing something wrong. So that's, I think, a universal thing. But that's where I think independent journalism is necessary, and I think that's where people who are willing to be principled rather than partisan have to come in and do that job. The problem is that I think prior to the internet becoming as powerful as it has, there was the opportunity for one side to really dominate that conversation and for there to be way more of a left-wing bias in the media than a right-wing bias. And that's something that we're slowly overcoming, because I think it's becoming quite unsustainable nowadays if you're a mainstream publication to only publish things that are pro the left-wing government or pro the right-wing government, because there's so much challenge to you from people who are speaking out about things online or using their platforms and podcasts. And you see that now, for example, President Trump is being widely criticized from the left and right for his policy in Iran. And while I actually happen to agree with many of the things that he's doing, I nonetheless think it's very healthy that there's a broad range of opinion being represented across the old and new media.
You have, as I mentioned earlier, just released your book here in Sweden, A Migrant's Love Letter to the West. I'm very curious how you, as an British man, looks at Sweden and what the image of Sweden is today, because earlier, as we think, the image of Sweden was very positive. It's a country with high living standard, a lot of safety, high quality products, a welfare state that is very broad and helps everybody. Has the image of Sweden changed over the decades, or are you still seeing Swedish as this kind of paradise that everybody wants to copy?
Well, I think that there certainly had been a lot of that in the past, but some of the things that I think those of us outside of Sweden are hearing now is much more about the consequences of your disastrous immigration policies and how that is playing out in terms of gang activity, violence, the failure of integration, the safety of women as a result, and all of these things, which are by no means unique to Sweden. We have many of the same problems here in Britain. And elsewhere around Europe, as I'm sure you know. But that is something that is increasingly becoming a story. Now, perhaps, I don't know, I'd be very curious to hear your opinion about how representative those perspectives are.
I think as we have a lot of debate here in Sweden, of course, between the different views, but some people have been criticizing a lot that there's been a lot of consequences with the mass immigrations. And of course, everybody today admit that we have big problems with criminality. That we have gangs, that there's about 62,000 active people in different kind of criminal organizations. We have a lot of bombings. They are shooting each other on the streets. So Sweden is not the same today as it was for maybe 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So that is a correct picture.
That's the story we're hearing.
Yes.
That's the story we're hearing. And it's extremely worrying because I've never been to Sweden, not yet. I was hoping to come, but I couldn't this time. But I have been elsewhere in Scandinavia, and I do think that they're really wonderful societies. There's a level of social cohesiveness, a kind of peacefulness to those places, a feeling of commonality between people. Every time I've been to Norway and Denmark, I've always felt very comfortable, very safe. I've always felt there's the kind of reserved friendliness about people from that part of the world. And so to hear that you are now having, gang attacks and bomb attacks, I don't think this is the Swedish way, so to speak, from what, as an outsider, I can observe. And I think that's very worrying because that's a very difficult problem to deal with. That's a much easier problem to prevent than it is to address once it's already happened. And I know that some of your neighbors are taking drastic action, and perhaps some parties in Sweden are also taking drastic action and advocating pretty drastic policies. And this is a Europe-wide problem that we're all going to have to solve and learn from each other in solving.
Yeah, Sweden is still very peaceful in most of the places. So there's some spots, like some of the suburbs, where these gangs has a lot of influence. So it's still true that it's very a lot of cohesion in Sweden, and there's a lot of peace in many places. But we also are a society that are have high trust to each other. So we never thought that people could misuse the trust and the friendliness and openness that we had for people who came here. And so we are really taken by surprise.
Well, on that point, I think you summarized the entire problem of the Western world over the last couple of decades, which is the failure to imagine that other cultures and other civilizations are different, they have different values, and this assumption that everybody in the world is the same. So if you flung your doors open to people who are fleeing North Africa or the Middle East, they are going to come to Sweden and become Swedish in exactly the way that you are and your family and friends are overnight. And that just isn't true. Cultures are not the same. Religions don't teach the same values to their adherents that your society does. And that's been really the big problem, this deep naivete about what it is to deal with people from different cultures. And you see that across all kinds of social issues. You see that across our attitudes to geopolitics. You see that across our attitudes to the Middle East. You see that, of course, when it comes to immigration policy. And the situation you described is exactly the situation I described in An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, because what I'm saying is the West is great. It's brilliant. And I, as an immigrant, can testify to this. But if we don't remember how we got here, if we don't protect the values and the structures and the institutions that created that civilization, then we risk losing it all. And that's the direction of travel. So when you say most of Sweden is still great, most of Britain is still great, and most of America is still amazing, and most of Germany is brilliant, and most of France is too. But if we allow this direction of travel to continue, we're going to end up in a very bad way, because, as I said earlier, these problems are very difficult to fix once you've created them. And that's why, first and foremost, we've got to stop immediately making the problem worse. And then we've got to think very hard, and we've got to be pretty brave about how we deal with them as we move forward.
Do you think this insight will sink in by time? I mean, before Europe was very coherent. Each country was very coherent. We traveled the world as tourists, and we saw the different culture. We were exotic. We were fascinated by it. And then we had this mass immigration with different values, and all of a sudden, you know, all these cohesion came under constraint. Are these insights starting to sink in, or are we still not, you know, accepting, understanding that we have different kind of logic how we think?
I think that it's starting to sink in with many people. If you look at concerns about illegal immigration in Britain, it's essentially become a cross-party consensus. The Labour government, which was elected, the left-wing Labour government, which was elected only last year, came in promising to be humane and undo the evil right-wing, anti-immigration policies, which weren't particularly anti-immigration in the first place. Well, they are now talking tougher than the Conservative Party that was in power before them about illegal immigration. So it is starting to sink in. It's starting to sink in with voters and therefore with politicians. But we have so much more to do, I think, across Europe on addressing that issue. And I think it's important to say, Marco, that, we're not, I certainly wouldn't describe myself as anti-immigration. What I am anti is stupidity. And what I mean by this is, we welcomed, I don't know what the case is in Sweden, I'm sure you did too, many people from Ukraine after Putin's invasion of that country to Britain to be here as refugees. They're not causing any problems. We don't have Ukrainian gangs roaming around, blowing each other up or shooting or stabbing people. We welcomed Hong Kongers who were fleeing the CCP's takeover of Hong Kong. They're not causing problems or engaging in grooming gangs and raping British underage girls. We had immigration from parts of Eastern Europe when they first joined the European Union 20 years ago. Polish gangs are not roaming around Britain causing trouble. So we've got to be honest and say that it's not mass immigration, but it's immigration from incompatible cultures and religions that are unable to adapt, or perhaps unwilling to adapt to our values, and instead seek to impose their own. Many of these people, of course, come from highly violent, low-trust societies, and when they come here and bring their values and their attitudes to homosexuality and to women and to sexual relations between the sexes and to all of those things, that's when the problem starts. So rather than talking about immigration and mass immigration, we've got to stop being so politically correct and say that the problem is not necessarily immigration in and of itself, but it's the scale of immigration, in other words, the number of people coming over a short period of time, and also the types of people who we've been allowing to come in.
And how do you discern that so it not to become xenophobia to certain groups? You mentioned that most people don't have problem with the Ukrainians coming, but with the groups that has maybe created more problems than other groups, how do you be aware that you don't judge everybody from that country or that part of the world?
Well, I certainly don't think we should be judging everybody from that part of the world, but I think we should be aware that there are certain statistical realities. If people from country A are 10 times more likely to commit crime than people from country B, then perhaps we should be really very careful about letting in lots of people from country A. I think that's a perfectly reasonable position. And this isn't xenophobic. It's a sense of protecting your Swedish citizens, men and women and children, from crime. And so if there are people who are coming from a particular part of the world that are way, way more likely to commit sexual crimes, violent crimes, and all sorts of other crimes, then I think it's the duty of your government and your immigration authorities to make sure that they apply extra scrutiny to people who are coming from those places and those cultures and those backgrounds. I think that's a perfectly legitimate position.
Well, if I play the devil's advocate, I mean, people will say that then you are making up people equal. It's kind of racist.
People are not equal. People are not equal. If they commit crimes at different rates, they're not equal, and so they should not be treated equally. I understand why at airports we search, mothers with their babies as well as men in their 40s, but that's something of a practical necessity. In reality, we know that those two groups of people have a very different propensity for committing crimes. And so I think it makes perfect sense, if you are attempting to police the borders of your country, to give extra scrutiny to people from certain racial, ethnic, religious, sexual, and other characteristics, and to be discriminating about that. Discrimination, yes, discrimination blindly and mistreating people simply because of the color of their skin or their religious background is wrong. But being discriminating means, in English at least, choosing carefully what you do and what you don't do. And we have people are not the same. Cultures are not the same. Religions are not the same. And if you observe, if I said that in the abstract, I can understand why people would be offended. But if you look at the rates of crime being committed by people from different countries in your country, you don't even need to make this an abstract conversation. Just look at the statistics and go, well, maybe we let more of these people in and not as many of these people in. That's perfectly legitimate. And actually, selective immigration policies is exactly what every sensible country should be doing. We should be welcoming people in who are going to integrate quickly, who are going to become Swedes or Brits or whatever rapidly, who are compatible with the values of our societies, who are not going to become a menace to women and girls in our society. And that's a perfectly reasonable position.
I would like to hear your take on one of the things that's been coming up now. It's an old story, but it's very current now with a report from Baroness Casey concerning the exploitation of young girls in the UK and these grooming gangs it went on for I think 30 years or even more, and the police and the social authorities they work to cover up the stories because they didn't want it to be labeled as racist. What is your take on these grooming gangs in UK and how the public has handled it?
Well, let's be honest. The grooming gangs are one of the most horrific, outrageous scandals in the modern history of Britain and actually Europe at large. What happened was that gangs of predominantly Pakistani men, even Pakistani is not entirely accurate because I believe that they're people from a very particular part of Pakistan, a mountainous area with a very clannish culture. So we've got to be quite granular. There are many people who want to say, well, these are, Muslim grooming gangs or Pakistani grooming gangs. Even that I don't think is quite accurate. We've got to be quite accurate with this. But the problem was that there were gangs of these men from a very particular ethnic background who were finding vulnerable white and Sikh girls, usually, and gang raping them, torturing them, abusing them in the most unimaginable ways that I don't even want to talk to you and your viewers about, because the stories are just so absolutely horrific. And we've had a number of the victims of these gangs on our show, and just hearing their stories is absolutely awful. But what's much more awful, even than that, if you can imagine that, is the fact that their abuse was not only not rapidly investigated and prosecuted and the perpetrators dealt with in the harshest possible ways, but on the contrary, the abuse they experienced was covered up by the authorities, by the social services, by the councils, by the police in some cases, because they were concerned about the fact that there was an ethnic dimension to these crimes. In other words, that these crimes were being overwhelmingly and vastly disproportionately committed by this particular subset of the Pakistani community here in the UK. This is an outrage. The people responsible for this should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The people who were the perpetrators of this should be treated. I mean, look, they should. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know exactly what the law is, but they should be treated as harshly as possible. Those of them that can be deported should be deported. Those of them that are dual citizens should be stripped of their British citizenship. And frankly, I don't care if they fall out of the plane on the way back to Pakistan or wherever it is that they come from. I say this, half jokingly, but I mean it. Like the fact that we are so deeply concerned about their human rights and we might not deport them back to Pakistan because of this or because of that, I think it's completely unacceptable. I don't care about their human rights. These are monsters who should be treated as such. And the people who facilitated their abuse and who allowed it to happen should be treated as monsters as well.
How is the British public handling this, the politicians, the newspapers? Are they still reluctant to talk about this? Are they relativizing it? Or are they, we want this in full openness now. We want to look at the rights of these girls who were abused, and we want to go to the bottom with this question? Or is there still this reluctancy?
Well, thanks to the courage of the survivors of these crimes and the fact that there were some people willing to amplify their voices over time, and the end of social media censorship, which is how many of these crimes continue to be suppressed and the discussion of them was suppressed. Thanks to all of that, this story is now bigger than it's ever been. That doesn't mean that the entire establishment has embraced this conversation at all. I don't think that's remotely true. And in fact, several former BBC commentators, people like Emily Maitlis, are still talking about, Marco, I don't know if you can imagine this, and I don't know if your viewers and listeners can imagine just the horror of this reality in Sweden. But when we talk about this issue, they still talk about, well, how do we talk about this issue without allowing this to be talked about by the racist or the far right, as if that's much more important than protecting these children and young girls and women, or delivering
justice. Wasn't that the core of the problem? Just what you described now?
Yes, exactly. And this is just, if you think about the moral inversion that we're talking about, where good becomes bad and bad becomes good, to the point where people are unwilling to understand that it's more important to protect your own children and young women than to make sure no one says the wrong word about the people who raped those women. I just think it represents a complete misunderstanding of reality, and where, frankly, the vast majority of the people of this country are at in terms of seeing this issue. So, yes, thankfully, we're talking about this now more than ever. But I certainly wouldn't say that we've remotely got to a position where these issues are being fully investigated or the criminals are being punished as they should be. Some of the sentences have been absolutely outrageous. There are cases of people who've raped 10 or 15 girls who are getting a year or two per rape. In some cases, some of these people are let out after a few years from prison. And my view is, if you've committed crimes of this nature, frankly, we should be getting you out of the country if we possibly can. But if we cannot, you should be dying in prison.
Konstantin, let me come back to the question of that kind of mirror thinking that we think everybody thinks about as we do. We spoke about that when it comes to people migrating to Europe. Let me talk about the geopolitics. I know that you have said that you think Trump gets things wrong when it comes to Putin. Can you, since you are born in Russia, you have, you know the Russian way of thinking. What does the West or Trump get wrong when it comes to trying to deal with Putin and bringing peace to the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Yeah, so, just so that your viewers and listeners understand my perspective, I try to criticize or praise people when they do the right thing or the wrong thing. And so, for example, I think what President Trump has done in the Middle East has been very, very wise in terms of addressing the threat of the Iranian regime, the Islamist Iranian regime acquiring nuclear weapons. But when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, I do think some of the American negotiating tactics have been incredibly naive. Steve Witkoff, for example, I don't know him personally, and I don't want to say anything about him personally, but in terms of how he has conducted these negotiations, it seems to me that he massively overestimates how interested Russia is in peace and massively underestimates the importance of making sure that Russia knows that if they do not do a peace deal, then bad things will happen. I thought, and I was very excited, someone who wants the Ukraine conflict to be ended, and ended in a way that secures Ukraine's long-term survival. I was very excited about Trump coming in for a second term, because what I thought he would do is offer Russia a carrot and a stick. And I thought that what would happen is the stick would be, look, if you do not accept the deal we're offering, we're going to give Ukraine way more support than they currently have, so that they can actually push you out of Ukraine. Or you can do a deal now where Ukraine gets to secure its long-term survival, and you, Vladimir Putin, get to save face. You get to say if you won, you get to annex some land which you currently control, etc. That, I thought, would be the tactics. It seems to me the tactics so far are simply to say to Vladimir Putin, come on, Vladimir, let's end the killing. We all want peace. Well, that seems to me to be missing the reality that Vladimir Putin does not want peace. He wants to use this opportunity to get the best possible deal for Russia, and he's prepared to keep the war going to allow that to happen.
And how do we, as a Russian, or you call yourself a Brit, of course, but from your ancestry Russian, how do you think we should understand Putin and understand the Russian mentality in when it comes to Ukraine and the conflict with the West, because it's not only a conflict with Ukraine but also a conflict with the West? How do they think? How can you help us to understand the Russian mentality?
You don't even need to have been born in Russia. You don't need to have been born in Russia like me. I have, by the way, many friends and family in Ukraine as well, so I kind of have a varied perspective on that. But you don't need to be any of those things. You just need to look at history. Every time Russia is strong, it seeks to expand westwards in order to protect its western flank. This was the case during and after World War II. One of the reasons that after World War II, the borders of Poland got moved further to the west was so that Russia could have more of a buffer on its west. And there's a geographical and geopolitical, geostrategic reason for that. Much of Russia's industrial base, all of its major cities, much of its economy, much of its intellectual economy is all in the very westernmost part of Russia, the kind of western sliver, the 20% of the country, which is very vulnerable to invasion and has been invaded and destroyed repeatedly over and over, including, if I may say so, Marco, by the Swedes over time. And so Russia is very, very insecure about it. And anytime it has the opportunity, it will expand westwards, to say nothing of the fact that the conflict in Ukraine is simply about land and territory, and of course the glory of Vladimir Putin and securing his name in the history books. He's been absolutely explicit about seeing Ukraine as Russian land. Some people might say he has some historical claim to that. I personally think that while there is some truth to that, if we went around enforcing historical claims to land, we'd be in a permanent state of global conflict. So I don't think that's an acceptable way to do these things. But nonetheless, he sees Ukraine as Russian land. And of course, there are other parts of what is Eastern Europe that would be interesting to any Russian leader who is strong and who sees the West as weak, who would want to take advantage of that and secure more land. So that's what this conflict is about. Don't make no mistake about it. Russia wants to recapture land. It's revanchism in its purest form. And that's what the source of this conflict is, which is how you understand how this conflict needs to be settled. It needs to be settled by Vladimir Putin being a clear understanding that his attempt to get more land will cost him more than he is prepared to pay.
So what is your recommendation? Is it that we should be strong militarily, but should we also try to normalize the relationship with Russia in the long run and resume trade and so on?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to deal with the conflict in Ukraine and see how that can be resolved. Now, in my opinion, the way that gets resolved, as I mentioned, is America and the West together should say to Vladimir Putin very clearly, look, this war has been going on for a long time. It has cost the Russian economy and the Russian people a lot. And of course, the same with Ukrainians. We want peace. And the way that that peace needs to be achieved is by finding an amicable agreement here that respects the interests of the Ukrainian people and also the Russian people. That means that Ukraine has to have long-term security in the form of some kind of peacekeeping force on the border, or some kind of DMZ of the Korean nature. It can't just be the word of Western powers, which we have seen that they're not willing to keep. So that's one part of it. But if you're not willing to do that, then we will give Ukraine so many weapons and so much support militarily and financially that they will be able to fight you so effectively that it's going to cost you way more than you're prepared to pay. Once you've got that out of the way, the West, of course, has to be strong militarily and be a very strong deterrence to Russia's any further ambitions of going westwards. And from that perspective, then there is the possibility of a gradual rapprochement and a more peaceful coexistence with Russia. But that will take some time, given some of the terrible things that Russia has done in Ukraine.
So you think that the European stand is the right way?
No, I think Europe has been incredibly cowardly and unwilling to support the Russians to anything like the level that would match the things that we said out loud. We told Ukraine, we're on your side, Slava Ukraini, you're fighting for all of us, blah, blah, blah. But then we never actually supported them to anything like the same extent. You'll remember, Marco, in the early days of the war, Germany sent a few thousand helmets. That was the extent of their support, because they made themselves so dependent on Russian gas. And Europe in general made itself very vulnerable, something that President Trump rightly warned about long before the war broke out. Peaceful coexistence with Russia relies on an ability to deter Russian aggression. And this is something that, people have known for thousands of years, the Roman saying, si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war, applies very strongly. And no, a Europe that's not even been spending 2% of its GDP on its military commitments, despite being part of NATO, is not a Europe that has been able to deter Russia, which is part of the reason the invasion happened in the first place.
But we see now the European countries are wrapping up their budgets for their military expenses. So there is a change right now. Yes,
and that's what should be happening.
Okay. Another take I would like to listen to is from you is the situation in the Middle East. Israel attacked... let me see, did I lose you?
No, I'm here.
Okay, sorry. So, yeah, and another thing that I'm wondering about is Israel has attacked Iran, which has been the head of the octopus, creating this ring of fire around Israel, and now America also went in and bombed these 3 nuclear sites. What is your take on the situation in the Middle East? How should we bring a more peaceful Middle East where there can become more of a peaceful coexistence between the Arabs and the Jewish people?
All right, Marco, let's solve the problem with the Middle East in the last 4 minutes we have remaining with a YouTuber and an interviewer. That I'm sure is the way this is going to get resolved. Look, if I knew how to solve the problem with the Middle East, I would be getting paid a lot more and not sitting here talking to you, most likely. My sense is that Israel has done the only thing that it could do in the circumstances. After October 7th, it clearly had to deal with the threat of Hamas. It also had to deal with the threat of Hezbollah and the Houthis. And we know that all of those threats to Israel's very existence and survival were being funded and orchestrated from Iran. Iran, which has repeatedly said that Israel should not exist, is run by an Islamist regime. These are people who are religious fanatics, and the fact that the IAEA, an independent body, found that they were enriching uranium to weapons grade levels and also avoiding inspections and concealing certain elements of their nuclear program was completely unacceptable, not only to Israel, but also, by the way, to many Arab Muslim countries in the Middle East as well. The Saudis, for example, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, he's on record calling Iran the equivalent of Nazi Germany in the Middle East, and saying that if they pursue nuclear weapons, we're going to have to do it as well. So the fact that President Trump and Israel have taken out Iran's nuclear program, I think, is incredibly important. That does not mean that I am particularly excited about the possibility of regime change, evil as the regime in Iran is, because there was always a risk of the type of thing we've seen in other countries where a brutal civil war emerges. There's all sorts of terrorist activity. and so on. So I am not some kind of war hawk who's enthusiastic about, replacing the Ayatollah with somebody I personally think he should be replaced with. If the people of Iran want to take their destiny in their own hands and choose leaders that reflect their views better, which I think there could be the possibility of, that is up to them. And in that situation, we may want to support them. But for the moment, I am very glad that Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons have been degraded, and we're going to have to remain vigilant about that, because they will continue to pursue them as long as that regime remains in power.
At the core of this situation is the war in Gaza, and we see a lot of protests in the West against Israel. How do you see these protests? I mean, they feel that there's a strong part that is going into Gaza and creating a lot of sufferings for the civilians, the children, and there's problems with, utilities and food and so on. And there's a lot of demonstrations, especially here in Stockholm. We have every week very big demonstrations against Israel. How do you see these demonstrations? Is it important political pressure putting on Israel, or is it actually running with an enemy to the West like the Hamas, giving them support? It's a very complicated situation. What is your take on it?
My take on it is very simple. I think the scenes that are coming out of Gaza are horrific. I think the suffering of the people there is awful. I think nobody could look at some of the footage that's coming out of there and be happy that it's happening, which is why it's so important that all of us call on Hamas to release the hostages and to surrender the terrorists who took them. And the moment that happens, all of that suffering, needless suffering, will end immediately.
Okay, Konstantin, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. I'm so grateful that you could give some of your insights and thoughts. And thank you very much for coming to Hotspot.
I really appreciate you having me on the show, and thank you so much for your time.
And thank you for also the audience for listening. Thank you very much.